So in her conference speech, Labour MP Shabana Mahmood, who is on the left side of UK politics, warned that a healthy patriotism is being squeezed into something like ethnonationalism, which is a politics that doubts whether someone who looks and worships like her can ever be truly English or British.
Patriotism, a force for good, is turning into something smaller, something more like ethnonationalism, which struggles to accept that someone who looks like me and has a faith like mine can truly be English or British.
So this is certainly the kind of phrase that wins easy applause from her base. I've already touched and shared my thoughts on English identity and English ethnicity, but her remarks use a word that instantly triggers strong emotions from all sides. And it reignited this ongoing battle on how we define Englishness. Who gets to define Englishness? Who can claim Englishness or Britishness? And what happens when identity hardens into exclusion? I personally think we need to have a deeper, more honest, more robust, and even more nuanced conversation. Yes, nuanced conversation about this concept of ethno-nationalism. Is ethno-nationalism always a problem, or is there a way to separate its ugliest histories from the ordinary, natural, and inevitable human need for continuity, culture, and a shared home? Well, yes, the word carries heavy baggage because of the atrocities committed in its name: the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, forced expulsions, apartheid, segregation. These are all examples of ethno-nationalism that were weaponized into hierarchy and violence. So in this form, of course, it is clearly a problem. But ethno-nationalism can mean that a nation is just bound by a shared ethnic identity and ancestry. That in itself does not necessarily mean exclusion or second-class citizenship. Nations often need a dominant story, shared symbols, and a sense of continuity to thrive. Without some form of cultural anchor, societies risk fragmentation, which is what we're seeing in British society today. There have been numerous studies that suggest that more homogenous societies tend to enjoy higher levels of trust and cohesion, cooperation, particularly when it's combined with strong and corruption-free institutions. Japan and Iceland are often cited as examples where relative ethnic homogeneity coincides with high level of trust, low crime. The reasoning is straightforward. When people share a common language, set of norms, everyday cooperation is easier, value clashes are less frequent, and even when misunderstandings arise, they are less likely to be met with deep suspicion. I believe in a cultural baseline, one that is set by the majority, the ethno-cultural majority, and I think this is what holds a society together for everyone. Without this sharedness, then everyday interactions and situations turn into moments of confusion and mistrust between people who should be able to rely on one another. I'll give you an anecdotal example from my own life and the reason I am all for sharedness, a common standard, especially when it comes to language. I genuinely think it's not ideal to walk into whole neighborhoods in Britain and barely hear English spoken. I think it's quite absurd. And I say this as an immigrant myself because walking in those areas makes me feel excluded and othered. That is why this idea of diversity being this haven-like society is just a big lie. Okay, yes, what about those parts of Spain, for example, along the Costa del Sol or in towns like Benidorm, where British expats or immigrants, okay, fine, finally cluster together and English is the main language of everyday life? On the surface, that looks like the same thing as walking through parts of Britain where you barely hear English spoken. But I think there's small differences. In Spain, for example, most Britons, they remain residents rather than actual citizens. So as guests, they're not redefining or trying to redefine what it means to be Spanish, nor are they shaping Spain's political or cultural core. Spain remains firmly Spanish. In the UK, however, immigrants are not just residents. Many become full citizens and even dual citizens, which Spain doesn't even allow. And that changes the equation a bit because integration and a shared cultural baseline matter far more if there is a likelihood that entire groups are going to become full citizens and are supposed to become part of that nation's future. And back to shared language. I still remember my time at university when I worked in a small food factory on the side, and this factory supplied major supermarkets. Most of my colleagues at that time were Eastern European, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that many of them couldn't speak a single word of English. I used to wonder how they could possibly follow recipes, read labels, or understand safety instructions. If I had known better, I would probably have reported it to someone because it was really strange. And then another time more recently when I had to take my daughter to the doctor, the woman checking on her, which was a GP, I think from South Asia, she literally asked me like this, "Hair nappy good?" I was like, what? Nappy good? I froze. I was thinking, how can you take care of my daughter's health, my child's health, if you can't speak in full bloody sentences? Like, I would never accept this from a native British person. Why do we think it's any way, shape or form acceptable if someone is not white? These are just basic things that should not happen in the first world. I'm sorry. So the United Kingdom, it cannot really coherently function as an ethno-national state, and its very structure, it makes it quite impossible. Britain is not a single ethnic nation. It never really has been. It's been a union of historic peoples, the English, the Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, each carrying its own traditions, languages, and its own sense of belonging. Britishness is therefore, it's really more of a civic identity, whether people like it or not. This doesn't mean ethnicity is irrelevant. The nations in the UK are rooted in real historic communities, like I mentioned. The truth is that ethno-nationalism makes sense at the level of the separate nations, not as the union as a whole. So is ethno-nationalism on the rise? And why is that the case if it is? Before I go there, I do think it is rising. However, I actually am not convinced that the majority of people in Britain are ethno-nationalists or are comfortable identifying with that label. The word itself, like I mentioned, still carries heavy historical baggage and weight. In the public imagination, it is still tied to fascism, ethnic cleansing, so it just doesn't sit right with a lot of people's conscience. Also, many white Britons actually do not even think of themselves in ethnic terms at all. They just do not. Their identity has long been cultural, traditional, civic, or just simply individual. And because they have historically been the majority, they have never had to conceptualize themselves as an ethnic group. Many people's daily life actually also pushes against these ethnic categories. Many people have friends, colleagues, even partners from other backgrounds. This is just common now. So families themselves are increasingly mixed, which makes these rigid ethnic boundaries feel really artificial and odd. And the reason I know that many white people don't see themselves in ethnic terms is that this was actually one of the biggest bugbears of race activists, the ones that were pushing for global racial awakening after the George Floyd killing. They would always complain that white people never saw themselves as a race, and then they would frame it as a privilege. So their aim was to raise the racial consciousness and awareness of everyone. So what happened is that everyone became obsessed with race, and these race activists try to bring race into every and any situation involving people of different backgrounds. I used to push back against this heavily. I used to say, why not take the opposite approach? Why not de-racialize situations, de-racialize interaction, so we could all enjoy that supposed privilege? Why insist on putting race at the center of everything? No one listened. Instead, what we got was a culture fixated on race. So now when a black and brown person is in a certain position now, people don't see the person, people don't see the character, they see the race. The backlash is here in full force. Oh, this is a DEI hire and so on. I mean, what did race equality champions think would happen? If you condition everyone to think racially, do not be surprised when people actually do. But I digress. So it's not common for white people to see themselves in racial terms, and usually if they do want to express a sense of belonging, they tend to reach for softer language, culture, way of life, tradition, values. So these words are less charged than ethnicity, but they gesture at the same desire for continuity. Now, even though many are reluctant to call themselves ethno-nationalists, this instinct though, this desire doesn't disappear simply because the label is feared or disdained. If the civic story continues to fray, meaning if the institutions cannot supply a convincing account of who we are. If national symbols are treated as suspect, if majority identity is singled out as something to apologize for constantly, then many will fall back on trying to reassert their identity in ethnic terms. That reassertion doesn't necessarily need to be violent or hostile. It may just appear as a quiet but firm insistence that the majority culture has a right to recognition and deserves the same respect as any other identity. So yes, that's why we are seeing a steady rise of ethno-nationalism sentiments, at least. This is just the predictable outcome of cultural, of economic, of political choices that have been made over decades. Of course, mass immigration is one of the obvious drivers. Within the space of a single generation, the character of towns and cities have changed. And it didn't help that there wasn't a clear model of integration. Multiculturalism encouraged groups to preserve their difference, yet the majority culture has been treated as something awkward. Every minority identity is affirmed as being enriching, but Britishness, Englishness in particular, often framed as sources of embarrassment and oppression. We saw this recently with the reaction to Operation Raise the Colours, the campaign to fly the Union flag and St. George's flag in public. In most countries, this would barely register as controversial, even fragmented countries. It would be the most normal thing. Okay, it's the country's flag, so. But in Britain, it became a cultural flashpoint, mocked by commentators as jingoistic, sneered at by parts of the media, dismissed by academics, the elite class, as xenophobic. So symbols that should be unifying are treated with contempt. And then on top of that, diasporic nationalism and patriotism, meaning the way migrant communities in Britain continue to express their loyalty to their homelands through flags, festivals, protests, political activism. But when the majority attempts the same, when there's just even a little expression of pride, it is treated as parochial at best, dangerous at worst. People start to wonder, why does my identity have to remain hidden and silent? Where do we go from here? Well, if we are serious about addressing the rise of ethno-nationalism, then simply condemning it as Shabana Mahmood will not be enough. Warnings alone do nothing to calm the conditions that make it grow. If you don't want ethno-nationalism to rise and take root, then you have to actively and purposefully treat and recognize majority culture as the foundation rather than as a problem to be managed. The majority cannot be made to feel like strangers in their own land. A confident, grounded, and respected majority culture is literally what gives everyone else the space to belong. Guys, if you have made it this far, I'm so grateful. If you got value from this, the best way to support is to like, subscribe, and if you're feeling generous, become a member here or on Patreon. Let me know what you think about anything that was discussed today. See you soon.